thanks very much, Michal, and thanks again for inviting me. As Michal was saying, as a product of the Donegal diaspora to Scotland, I'm delighted to be here in a place where I think, unique in Ireland, you all understand my accent. So I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you about the problem of climate change. I think I wanted to start with, I suppose, one of the best-known Donegal sons, Seamus Heaney, who I always find inspiration in. And one of the phrases he used in his poetry there was, "The world where we are to make our tarry ark lies before us." And that is, in a sense, what we're talking about today. We're talking about choosing a future. And we're talking about a problem which has really become very clear on us in the past few decades. As we argue about what might cause climate change, we can't argue about the thermometers that tell us about it. And as we look at the way the world has changed its temperature over the past 150 years, you'll see the colours on the world here changing from blue to yellow to orange as we warmed consistently over the past 120 years, today by about 1.1 degrees more than we were in pre-industrial times. But I show you this map for a couple of reasons as well, because of course, you'll notice that the continents warm much more quickly and to a higher degree than the oceans. And therefore, when we talk later on today about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, it's important to remember that for those of us who live on land, that will be a much more substantial change than will be the global average as a whole. Secondly, of course, we're also seeing an acceleration of those problems in the past few years. The world's warmest 4 years have occurred in the past 4 years. 17 of the world's warmest 18 years since we started having reliable temperature observations have occurred in the current century, in the last 18 years. So we're living in exceptional times, and for those of you who are under the age of 30, and there are a few in the audience, well, you've never experienced a month during your life when the average temperature of that month was less than the temperature of any corresponding month on average in the 20th century. So we're in exceptional times. And we've a pretty good idea what's causing those exceptional times to arise. Because if we look at the observations of the key greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, from a number of locations that you can see here, on the left-hand side, the South Pole, and on the right-hand side, the North Pole, from all those stations that we're measuring it, you'll see as the years progress how the concentration of carbon dioxide consistently increased. You'll see the kind of sawtooth appearance on the graph on the right, where the concentrations go down in the summer and up in the winter, largely because of the Northern Hemisphere's land masses where plants grow and where they take in CO2 during the summer months and then release them to the winter months when there's no photosynthesis taking place. But you'll notice the way that graph is consistently rising above the level, perhaps, that starts here at about 1979 at a concentration of about 336 parts per million. And the global atmosphere concentration, you'll see, has passed 350 by 1989. You'll notice how the bits on the right-hand side of the graph are dancing a little more quickly. And that's because the northern hemisphere is composed of land mass, mainly. So you have vegetation growing there. So you get that seasonal cycle much more enhanced than you do in the southern hemisphere, which is mostly ocean, and which doesn't have that rather sort of dramatic jumping up and down that you can see. But you can see that by the beginning of this century, we're beginning to approach 400 parts per million. And at the last count, we're now well over 400 parts per million as a global average. So we've transformed the atmosphere. We've changed the atmosphere very dramatically, even in the past 40, 50 years. How much of a time span does that represent? Well, we can push that record back a little with obviously a lot less stations to measure in. We're down essentially to one here in the Hawaiian Islands. And what it tells us is the trend you see there is not something new. It's been consistent for the past 70 years or so at least. And we can go a little further and push that record back using bubbles in our ice caps, using tree ring analysis. And you can see that what happens then is that the concentrations begin to settle down. and they settled down around the 19th century at a level of about 280 parts per million. And that's what we call the pre-industrial concentration. So we've gone from 280 to 410 in the course of a few centuries. And even if we push that record back even further, if we go back using bubbles we analysed from the glaciers of the North and South Poles, then we can see that that concentration never goes higher than about 280, all the way back through human occupants of this planet, all the way back for at least 800,000 years. The record shows the ups and downs of the glacials and interglacials, yes, but never anything like the transformation that we've achieved in the past century or so on this planet. This is, of course, something that we know, but we don't actually see it happening. We don't see carbon dioxide. It's a colourless gas. If we were to trap it and put it in a balloon, it would look like this big orange balloon here. 1 tonne of it would be the kind of volume you would have. And for every one of us in the room today, we are responsible in Ireland for around about 13 of those balloons every year. It's about 50% higher than the average EU citizen. And if we were to look even at 1 day of production of our CO2 in Ireland and pile those balloons up at the entrance to Dublin Bay here, you can see 160,000 of them piled up would look like this. That's what we do in 1 single day. So we have an enormous capacity, even within Ireland here, to change the atmosphere. In fact, in Ireland, we produce something like we produce more CO2 than the 800 million poorest people living on this planet, which I'll come back to in a moment. This problem was brought home to me in a little visit I made to darkest parts of the interior of the bush in Zambia many years ago, about 4 years ago, and I went into a small city hall, country hall, community hall, rather like this, miles away from the nearest tarred road. Spoke to the community there, a bit like a church in the west of Ireland. All the men sat on one side and all the women sat on the other side. And of course I was very interested in the oldest person, and the person with the longest memory here. And I asked him what his problems were, and he said something that stayed with me. He said, well, when I was young, the rains were very much more reliable. I could go out and plant my seed in springtime. The rains would come, my corn would grow, I could feed my family for the year. Now I go out and plant my seeds and the rains don't come. They may germinate and shrivel up in the field. Even if I manage to grow my crops, sometimes in the harvest time, the rains have retreated early and my crop is ruined, it desiccates in the field. So it's very difficult for me to feed my family now in the way I could 40 years ago. And the question on his lips, which I daren't answer, was an obvious question. He was saying, well, who's doing this? And the truth of the matter, of course, is it's you and it's me that's primarily responsible for many of these irregularities that are occurring today in the poorest parts of the world. I went a little further on that trip to see the Victoria Falls, which is close by. And this is what they look like normally in June. This is a photograph taken in 2015. Where they feed into the largest man-made lake on the planet, Lake Kariba, which generates about 90% of the electrical power of that vast country of Zambia. Hugely dependent. When I went there, they looked like this. And you can see the contrast quite clearly. Now, it was the dry season, it was the middle of a drought, which was probably the worst in 50 years. But the consequences are quite profound if you think about it. Nothing going into the lake. Nothing going through the turbines, no electrical power being generated for the towns and cities of that vast country. Now, if you live in the tropics, you don't need electrical power for your heating, obviously, but you do need it to cook your evening meal. Otherwise, you're dependent on people like this man here, the charcoal seller. And the charcoal seller gets his supplies by deforesting the countryside around him. The urban dwellers come and try and drag wood into the cities in any way they can for fuel. And of course, a common thing with all of these stresses is it's the people at the bottom of the pyramid here. It's often the women who have to walk further for their firewood. It's often the poorest people who suffer in that situation of stress, and especially of climate stress. And the Minister mentioned the importance of not leaving people behind. And this is a very important aspect we have to think about, the idea of just transition. It's a just transition which applies to 3 key zones in the world. The first, of course, are the people who will lose their land completely in the mega deltas of the world, in Bangladesh, where up to 15 to 20% of the country will simply disappear due to rising sea level and also storm floods, in a catastrophic way, not a gradual way. And also, of course, the people who will lose essentially their culture, extinguished by the loss of their land in the small island developing states of the Indian Ocean and of the Pacific Ocean. We are doing this to them. We have to face that fact. And thirdly, of course, we know only too well the hardship of people living on the margins in Africa, between just enough rainfall to keep them going and not enough, where the fabric of society begins to disintegrate. So these are the problem areas we have to take responsibility for. And in terms of responsibility, we can see where the culprits lie. It's the big countries here that you see swollen up. The areas proportional to their emissions. The large countries of North America, of Europe, and of the developing countries of India and China in particular. And you can see how little is contributed to the problem in South America, in Africa, in parts of Asia. So there's a very distinct geographical imbalance here that we have to recognise, and we have to recognise responsibility to take action in our developed world as being much more important, much more serious than other parts of the world. And also, of course, just if you think this little island up here is insignificant, just to remind us that Ireland emits more greenhouse gases than 400 million of the poorest people in the world. Did I say 800? 400 million of the poorest people. So we are not, by any means, well, we're not out of the woods in terms of responsibility. When we look at the science, of course, the IPCC tell us that if we continue along the course we're on, we face 4 degrees of warming, 50-50 chance by the time your grandchildren will be your age. And that's a fairly catastrophic situation for the world as a whole. We know also that the rainfall changes will be more profound in certain areas. In the places that haven't enough rainfall to get by, they will have less. And some places that have too much will get more. But we know now very clearly from the IPCC that there are certain tipping points. And those tipping points are where we may enter non-recoverable zones, and ecosystems may disappear. And in that range of 1.5 to 2 degrees lies the coral reefs, which will be gone by 2 degrees. We will see the start of the loss of alpine glaciers, which will perhaps be non-recoverable as well once we exceed 2 degrees. We will see the loss of the Arctic summer ice, with all of the consequences we now know this will have for the jet stream and for weather events in places like Ireland, and even the West Antarctic ice sheet, which we know has been quite stable till now, but is beginning to show acute signs of destabilisation. So these are the important, if you like, thresholds that we have to avoid tipping over, because they may not be recoverable. And of course, down the road, if we exceed them, we face another set of tipping points of even more serious consequences in places like the Amazon, the East Antarctic ice sheet, and so on. So we have to be very careful about where we're going, and we know that 1.5 degrees is the safety zone, and that safety zone we're getting very close to at the moment. We will pass it under present conditions sometime in the next 12 to 20 years, unless we take very serious action to start reducing globally our carbon emissions. And we need about 45% reduction by 2030 to avoid 1.5 degrees. That's quite a substantial effort, quite a challenge for especially the developed countries of the world. Of course, if we had started when I spoke to you 14 years ago about the same problem, we could have had a much more leisurely reduction of about 3% per year. Now, if we're to get to that same end point, we need a reduction of about 10% per year. And if we leave things for another 5 to 6 years, then we're going to face a cliff of about 30% reductions per year, which is almost impossible to envisage. We're not immune in Ireland here. If you take any location in the country, we're already 0.5 degree warmer than we were 30 years ago. Malin Head here, for example, you can see at this time of the year, Malin Head is something like 0.7 degrees warmer than it was in the last 30-year average period. So we're not immune. We're going to face those problems, but we'll face them knowing that we'll face even larger temperature increases in the next 30 to 40 years. The modelling we've done in Maynooth here shows another ½ degree in the next 30 years. And, of course, the most serious consequence of all for Ireland are changes in rainfall, where we expect to see more in the way of winter rainfall in places like Donegal, where you certainly don't want it, and less in the way of summer rainfall in places in the east, where our towns and cities are mainly located and where water supply is becoming an even more acute situation. Dublin, as you know, is on a knife edge in terms of its water supply at the moment. We're seeing changes in extremes. We've had the wettest winter on record in 2015, 2016, you may remember. We've had the stormiest winter on record in 2013, 2014. We've had strange things happening like Hurricane Ophelia. We've had the beast from the east this time, last year in March, and the storm Emma associated with it. And here in Donegal, you'll all maybe remember the events of August 2017, where you had 63 millimetres of rainfall in 6 hours. Now, that doesn't sound something that rings a bell with you, but if I tell you that was 10% of the entire rainfall received in the Dublin area in the whole year that you got here in Donegal in 6 hours. So it's not surprising that you got the kind of scenes that you see here. So extremes are becoming more common. As you maybe remember, spring started in February this year. Your flowers were all out much earlier than usual. This time last year, of course, we were in a situation where we were in the cold of Storm Emma and of the beast from the east. So we're seeing the jet stream doing strange things. We're seeing it loop a lot more than we used to. Last year, for example, we had snow in the Sahara. We had the North Pole above freezing point. So these are things that are quite unusual and reflecting the way in which the jet stream has become rather more wavy, giving us extremes of all kinds, and perhaps related also, we think, to the decline of the Arctic sea ice and the warming of the Arctic. It does mean that for agriculture, for example, in Ireland, that there will be opportunities, but there will be casualties. Crops such as maize, wheat and barley will do quite well in the new Irish climate. Crops such as potatoes, which like a lot of summer rain, will not. And we know from the fodder crisis last year that grass will not do particularly well in the kinds of drier summers that we expect to see in the future. But we know also that the landscapes that we take for granted will be threatened as well. The peatlands, which of course depend on an all-round supply of rainfall, are not going to like drier summers. The salt marshes are not going to like the rises in sea level, which may wipe them out. The MacGill of the Connemara coast, that valuable ecosystem, equally will not like those kinds of higher sea levels. And the mountains around you here in Donegal. Well, what will happen as Donegal warms? The species will try to move uphill. What happens when they get to the top? They become extinct. So the Arctic char, for example, that you have in the Corrie Lake, we don't look after our peatlands very well, as you can see. The Arctic char, which you get in the Donegal corries, are not going to like warmer waters. The salmon are not going to like warmer waters. The curlew, which many of you maybe grew up listening to in the bogs, are down to 160 breeding pairs in Ireland at the moment. We've almost lost the corncrake. We're losing a lot of species as we face this biodiversity crisis that the Minister referred to here, which is so strongly linked to climate. Well, do we value it? Do we value biodiversity in Ireland? I think is a fair question. Our budget for our National Parks and Wildlife Service is €11 million a year. We give 16 million to the Greyhound Racing Board. We give 64 million to Horse Racing Ireland. Now, these are admirable causes, but should we perhaps be giving more to look at our biodiversity and save our biodiversity? Okay? About a third of what the recommendations are, in fact. We talk about the costs of tackling climate change. We don't talk about the costs of doing nothing. If we have an event in the Dublin area and we look at what kind of insurance claims are likely, you can see 2 to 3 metres of a flood will cause €1 billion of damage. These are the costs that we have to balance against the costs of taking action. And to get up the league table is not the end product, but to get at least the stigma of being a laggard off our backs is very important. And I think that's something we should try to do. I won't say anything about how society has changed because my 2 young colleagues here are going to do that very well indeed. Finally then, just to say, welcoming the Climate Action Plan, it has some very good aspects to it. The governance aspects are extremely positive and something that we should have done a long time ago. But to give credit where credit's due, the Minister has done a good job in getting that through government. There are aspects that you can take issue with. I think we can question whether 2% reduction per year to 2030 is enough and why it's not more, given the problems we have to face. 1 minute? Great. We have to move away from an obsession with marginal cost abatement curves. Climate change is bigger than the economics. It has to be something wider, deeply rooted in us, much more so than a cold economic appraisal. And we have to tackle agriculture. We have 676,000 more cattle in Ireland than we had in 2010. Unless we tackle that, we're simply fooling ourselves that the kind of tinkering around the edges is going to change that. So we have to do something there. We have 6-fold increases in enclosed feedlots in Ireland. 18% of our beef kill are from cattle that don't see the light of day or eat green grass. That's not origin green to my way of thinking. So we have to tackle that as well. And of course, I'm not saying Donegal is not doing its share, because if you look at these 2 maps, the green areas on the right are where farmers are getting most of their income for improving the environment and for biodiversity conservation. You can see west of the Shannon, the contrast, where 90% plus of the farmers in this part of the world get their income from that, whereas east of the Shannon, it's about 1/3. Yet, and here's the punchline, the farmers here get 1/3 of the cap income than the farmers east of the Shannon. So we have to look at that common agricultural policy in terms of preserving the family farm and preserving the way of life of those people who are greening agriculture in an active way. Because, and here's something just to finish on, well, the carbon footprint of the 20 meat and dairy companies that are largest in the world is greater than that of Germany, Canada, Australia, and even France. So these are the people that have to be brought into the net. Transport has to be tackled. And finally, my last slide, I promise. Finally, just the question of, well, what's our fair share of what the world has left in terms of the carbon budget? We're basing all our estimates in the plan on achieving a 2030 target. But we have a historic responsibility, just as the big countries of the industrialised world have, to go further than simply meeting that target. When will we move into carbon debt is the next big question. When will Ireland have used up a fair share of the remaining carbon budget? And the answer to that has been revealed quite recently, and it's about 2024. After that, the rest of the world will be asking us, how are you going to repay the carbon debt you have incurred in Ireland? And that will be the legacy for our grandchildren to think about. Thank you.